There is a place in Louisiana where the ground does not rest easy. A stretch of land along the Mississippi River where, for over 100 years, human beings were worked until their bodies gave out, buried in unmarked graves and then forgotten. Not by accident, not by oversight, by design. The people who owned this land made sure that the men, women, and children who built it, who bled for it, who died for it, would never be remembered. Their names were not written down. Their faces were never photographed. When they died, and they died young, most of them far younger than they should have, they were put into the ground without ceremony, without prayer, without any acknowledgement that a human life had ended. And the land moved on. The sugar cane kept growing. The mills kept grinding. The money kept flowing. And the dead stayed where they were, silent, invisible, forgotten. This is the story of that place and the people who disappeared into it. Tell me in the comments, do you know which parish in Louisiana this plantation sits in? Because the answer is not what most people expect. Now, let us begin at the very start, not with the death, not with the silence, but with the sugar. The year is 1795. The place is the colony of Louisiana, still under French control, still a wild and untamed stretch of land on the southern edge of North America. And on a plantation just outside of New Orleans, a man named Etienne de Boré is about to change everything. Boré is a French Creole planter. He has land. He has enslaved people to work that land, but he does not have a crop that will make him wealthy. Louisiana's climate is brutal, hot, humid, prone to flooding, prone to disease. Growing anything profitable here is difficult. Cotton has not yet become the dominant crop of the American South. Tobacco does not thrive in this soil. Indigo, which had once been Louisiana's main cash crop, is fatting. Boré needs something new, something that will grow in this heat, in this humidity, in this endless stretch of dark, rich, river-fed soil. Something that the world wants, something that will make him rich. And so, with the guidance of a skilled free black chemist named Antoine Morin, Boré attempts something that no one in Louisiana has successfully done before. He tries to grow sugarcane and process it into granulated sugar on a commercial scale. The attempt works. In 1795, for the first time in Louisiana history, a plantation produces enough sugar to sell on the open market, enough sugar to make real money. And from that single moment, from that first successful harvest, everything in Louisiana begins to change. The sugar industry does not grow slowly. It explodes. Within a decade, sugar plantations are spreading across the southern parishes of Louisiana like fire across dry grass. By 1802, there are 70 sugar plantations producing over 3,000 tons of sugar in a single year. By 1810, the number of plantations has doubled again. And with each new plantation comes a new demand. A demand for labor, for bodies, for hands to plant the cane, cut the cane, feed the cane into the grinding mills, and boil the extracted juice into the crystals of white sugar that European and American markets are desperate to buy. Sugar is not like cotton. It is not like tobacco. It does not require a moderate amount of work spread across a growing season. Sugar demands everything. It demands constant, brutal, unrelenting labor from the moment the cane is planted in January to the moment it is harvested and processed in the crushing heat of October through December. The harvest season, called grinding season, is when the true horror of sugar plantation life reveals itself, because during grinding season there is no rest. There is no Sunday off. There is no night. The cane must be cut before the first frost destroys the entire crop. And in Louisiana, frost can come at any time after December. So the enslaved people work. They work from before sunrise to long after dark. They cut 10-foot stalks of cane with machetes in heat that can exceed 100 degrees. They carry the stalks to the mill on their backs, in carts, in bundles that weigh more than they do. They feed the cane into grinding machines that crush the stalks and extract the juice. Machines that, if you are not careful, if you are not fast enough, if your hands slip for even a fraction of a second, will grab your arm and pull you in, and crush you, slowly. There was a practice on some sugar plantations, documented in historical records, of stationing a man with a sword next to the grinding mill specifically to sever the arm of any worker who was being pulled into the rollers before their entire body followed. Because being dismembered by the mill was so common that they had developed a procedure to manage it. That is the world that sugar created in Louisiana. That is the world that existed on every plantation along the Mississippi River in the early 19th century. And it is the world into which the people of this story were born, sold, and worked to death. The German Coast, that is what they called this stretch of land, a name that survives to this day, though the Germans who originally settled it are long gone. The German Coast runs along the east bank of the Mississippi River, through what are now the parishes of St. John the Baptist and St. Charles, northwest of New Orleans. In the early 1700s, German immigrants, settlers from the Rhineland region of what is now modern Germany, arrived in Louisiana in large numbers. They were not wealthy. They were not aristocrats. They were farmers, working people who had crossed an ocean looking for land, for opportunity, for a fresh start in a new world. They settled along the river. They cleared the land. They planted crops. And over time, as the sugar economy took hold, they transitioned, like almost everyone else in the region, into sugar planters. And like almost everyone else, they enslaved African people to do the work. The German coast became one of the most productive sugar-growing regions in all of Louisiana. The soil was rich. The river provided water and transportation. The climate was brutal but consistent. And by the early 1800s, the plantations of the German coast were among the wealthiest in the state. But wealth on the German coast came at a cost that is difficult to comprehend. A cost measured not in money or labor or time. A cost measured in human lives. Because Louisiana sugar plantations were not like other plantations in the American South. They were worse, significantly worse. In every other slave state, in Virginia, in Georgia, in Mississippi, in Alabama, the enslaved population was growing. Women were having children. Families, however brutally they were kept, were reproducing. The population was sustaining itself. In Louisiana, it was not. Louisiana was the only state in the entire American South where the death rate among enslaved people exceeded the birth rate. The only place where more enslaved people died each year than were born. Where the system consumed human beings faster than it could replace them. Where, to keep the plantations running, slave traders had to constantly import new people from the Upper South, from Africa, from anywhere they could find bodies willing or unwilling to sell, just to maintain the workforce. The numbers tell the story clearly. The average lifespan of an enslaved person working in a Louisiana sugar mill was said to be 7 years. 7 years. From the moment they arrived on the plantation to the moment their body gave out and they were buried in the ground, it was often less than a decade. Some lasted longer. Many did not. The work broke them. The heat broke them. The disease broke them. Malaria was endemic along the river. Yellow fever swept through the parishes in waves, killing hundreds at a time. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery. The enslaved people lived in small wooden cabins with no sanitation, no clean water, no medical care beyond what the plantation owner deemed worth providing, which was almost nothing because a sick worker could not cut cane and a dead worker could simply be replaced. This was not an anomaly. This was not an exception. This was the standard. This was how sugar plantations in Louisiana operated, for decades, for generations. And the men who owned them knew exactly what they were doing to the people who worked their land. They knew the death rates. They calculated them. They factored them into their business plans. They ordered new enslaved people the way a factory orders new parts because the old ones had worn out, had been used up, had died, and the land absorbed them, one by one, year by year, into unmarked graves that no one would ever find, into silence that no one would ever break. The Hadel family arrived in Louisiana in the early 1700s. Originally German, their name was spelled Heidel when they first came to the colony. They adapted quickly to French Louisiana. Their children learned French. Their name changed spelling and pronunciation over the generations until it became Hadel. And like many German immigrant families along the Mississippi River, they built their fortune on the land. In 1752, A man named Ambroise Heidel purchased a tract of property along the river in what would become St. John the Baptist Parish. He established a small indigo plantation. Indigo, the plant used to produce a vivid blue dye prized in European fashion, was one of Louisiana's early cash crops. Ambroise enslaved approximately 20 Africans to work his land. Many of them had expertise in indigo production, knowledge they carried from their homeland in West Africa, where indigo had been cultivated for centuries. The Heidel family did not remain small for long. As Louisiana's economy shifted toward sugar in the late 1790s and early 1800s, the Heidels, as they now spelled their name, shifted with it. Ambroise's son, Jean-Jacques Heidel, took control of the plantation in the late 18th century and oversaw its transition from indigo to sugar. And with that transition came everything that sugar demanded: more land, more enslaved people, more brutality, more death. By 1820, Jean-Jacques Heidel had passed the plantation to his two sons, Jean-Jacques Heidel Jr. and Marcelin Heidel, the third generation. They expanded the plantation's footprint. They increased the size of the enslaved population. They pushed deeper into the sugar economy, growing wealthier with each passing year. And the enslaved people who worked their land, the men, women, and children who cut the cane and fed the mills and boiled the juice and built the barrels and maintained the machinery and kept the entire operation running, they lived and they died on that land. In cabins that barely kept the rain out. In conditions that would kill most of them before they grew old. And when they died, they were buried in a section of the plantation set apart from the main house. A quiet stretch of ground, usually near the edge of the cane fields or along the tree line where the land met the river. No headstones, no markers, no names carved into anything, just the earth, just the silence, and eventually just the cane growing over them again as if they had never been there at all. By 1839, Marcelin Heidel had died. His widow, Marie Azalie Heidel, took over the plantation, and under her ownership, the Heidel Plantation, which would not be renamed Whitney until decades later, entered the most profitable period in its history. Marie Azalie was not a passive owner. She ran the plantation actively. She managed the enslaved population. She oversaw the sugar production. She made the decisions that determined who lived and who died on her land. By the time of her death in 1860, just months before the Civil War began, she owned over 100 enslaved people, 100 human beings, men, women, children, people who woke up every morning knowing that their labor, their bodies, their very lives existed to generate wealth for a woman they could never refuse, a woman whose name appears in the historical record, whose wealth is documented, whose death was noted in the newspapers of the time, the enslaved people who worked her land. Their names exist only in fragments, in sales records, in census documents where they are listed not by their full names but by first names only, or by numbers, or by descriptions of their physical condition. Some of them appear in the records of the Catholic Church, baptisms, confirmations, burials, but even there the information is incomplete, partial, thin, a first name, an age that may or may not be accurate, a date of burial that tells us when they died but nothing about how they lived. Nothing about who they were before they were enslaved. Nothing about the families they were taken from. Nothing about the lives they might have lived if they had been born free. The Whitney Plantation, as it would eventually come to be known, operated for over 200 years, from 1752 to 1975, 2 centuries of continuous operation. 2 centuries of sugar production. 2 centuries of enslaved labor, forced labor, brutal labor that consumed human beings and turned them into profit. And somewhere on that land, somewhere beneath the fields and the cabins and the mill and the big house, there are graves, unmarked graves. The graves of the men, women, and children who built that plantation with their hands and their blood and their broken bodies. How many graves exactly, no one knows. The records do not say. The land does not reveal them. And for most of American history, no one thought to look. But there is another story that is connected to this land. Another story that happened on the German coast, just miles from the Heidel Plantation, in January of 1811. A story that is so dark, so brutal, and so deliberately suppressed that most Americans have never heard of it. A story that, when you understand it, when you truly understand what happened and why, changes the way you see everything else about slavery in Louisiana, about the plantations, about the men and women who owned them, about the system that made all of it possible. It is the story of Charles Deslondes and the night that the German coast burned. The conditions on the sugar plantations of the German coast in 1810 were, by any measure, among the most brutal in the entire American South. The enslaved population outnumbered white residents by nearly 5-to-1 in some areas. More than half of the enslaved people on the German coast had been born outside of Louisiana, many of them in Africa itself, brought to the colony by slave traders who had been importing human beings illegally for years, even after the federal ban of 1808. The work was unending. The punishments were severe, and the life expectancy was devastatingly short. The planters of the German coast were not ignorant of the suffering they were inflicting. They were not unaware of the anger that was building among the enslaved population. They simply did not believe it mattered. They believed, as planters across the South believed, that enslaved people were docile, compliant, content or at least resigned to their condition, that the idea of a black person rising up against the system that enslaved them was, at worst, a fantasy, at best an impossibility. They were wrong. Charles Deslondes was approximately 31 years old in January of 1811. His exact origins are debated by historians. Some believe he was born in Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, and brought to Louisiana after the Haitian Revolution. Others, including the historian Gwendolyn Midlo Hall, suggest he may have been born in Louisiana itself. What is not disputed is what he was. He was a slave driver, an overseer of other enslaved people. He worked on the plantation of Colonel Manuel Andre, a wealthy sugar planter on the German coast. His job was to monitor the other enslaved workers, to ensure they met their quotas, to enforce discipline, to punish those who did not work fast enough or hard enough. It was a position of relative privilege within the brutal hierarchy of plantation life. Deslondes had access to information that most enslaved people did not. He moved between plantations. He spoke to other enslaved people across the region. He understood better than most how the system worked, where its weaknesses were, and he understood something else, something that the planters of the German coast had been desperately trying to forget. He understood that the Haitian Revolution had proven something that could not be unproven. It had proven that enslaved people could rise up, could fight, could win. In Haiti, enslaved Africans had overthrown their French masters, had destroyed the plantation system, had declared their freedom, had created a nation. It had taken years of brutal, bloody war, but it had happened. And the men and women of the German coast, enslaved, overworked, dying young, watching their children grow up into the same chains, they knew about it. They talked about it, in whispers, in the quiet hours after dark when the overseers were not listening. They talked about freedom, about what it might look like, about what it might take to get it. And Charles Deslondes listened, and he planned. The planning took months. It did not happen overnight. It did not happen in a single conversation or a single meeting. It was slow, careful, deliberate. Deslondes moved between plantations, using his position as a slave driver to travel without raising suspicion. He met with other enslaved people, with Maroons, fugitive enslaved people who had escaped into the swamps and bayous near the river and had been living as free men and women for years, sometimes for decades, hidden in the dense cypress forests where no one could find them. These Maroon communities were not small. They had existed along the Mississippi River for generations. They had their own leaders, their own rules, their own ways of surviving, and some of them were willing to fight. Deslondes recruited them, one by one, plantation by plantation. He did not promise them easy victory. He did not promise them that the fight would be without cost. He promised them something simpler, something more fundamental. He promised them a chance to run toward New Orleans, a chance to reach the city, a chance, however slim, to break free of the system that had consumed their lives. Each new recruit swore an oath, a war oath, borrowed from West African tradition, a tradition that many of the enslaved people on the German coast still carried in their memory, passed down through generations even after they had been torn from the continent of their ancestors. The oath bound them together, made them one. And by the first week of January 1811, Deslondes had enough people, enough courage, enough rage to begin. The night of January 8th, 1811 was dark. The kind of dark that only exists in the rural South. No streetlights, no electric glow on the horizon, no artificial light of any kind beyond the occasional flicker of a candle or a fire inside a cabin. The Mississippi River moved silently to the west, black and heavy and ancient. The sugarcane fields stretched in every direction, tall and thick and whispering in the night wind. And somewhere in that darkness, on the plantation of Colonel Manuel Andry, Charles Deslondes was getting ready. The first target was not chosen randomly. It was chosen with precision. Colonel Manuel Andry's plantation was not simply where Deslondes worked. It was where the uprising would begin, because it was where the greatest symbolic damage could be done. Andry was one of the wealthiest planters on the German coast, one of the most powerful men in the parish. A man who owned over 100 enslaved people and who ruled his land with the same casual brutality that every successful sugar planter of his era employed. Destroying Andry's plantation first, starting the rebellion on the land of one of the most powerful men in the region, would send a message that no planter on the German coast could ignore. A message that said, "We are here, we are awake, and tonight everything changes." Deslondes moved through the darkness with a group of men. The exact number at this point is debated. Some accounts say 40, others say fewer. But they were armed, not with rifles, not with military weapons, with what they had, machetes. The same machetes that had been used every single day to cut sugarcane. Tools of their own labor repurposed into weapons, axes, knives, whatever could be found, whatever could be taken without being noticed until it was too late to matter. They moved silently through the cane fields. The stalks were tall enough to hide them completely. The sound of their movement was swallowed by the rustling of 10,000 stalks moving in the wind. And when they reached the Andry plantation, when they emerged from the fields and into the open ground near the big house, they did not hesitate. Colonel Andry was in his home. The attack came fast, brutal. Andry himself was injured, badly wounded by most accounts, though he survived. His son, however, did not. The son was killed, cut down in the chaos of the initial assault. And then Deslondes and his men moved on, not away from the plantation, toward the next one, because the plan was never to stop at Andry's land. The plan was to move down the German coast toward New Orleans, plantation by plantation, mile by mile, gathering more people along the way. Enslaved men and women who had been waiting, who had heard the signal, a drum, beaten in the darkness, carrying across the flat Louisiana landscape with a sound that carried for miles, and who understood what it meant. Tonight is the night. And they joined, dozens of them, then more still. The rebellion swelled as it moved down the river road, absorbing enslaved people from plantation after plantation, growing in size and in fury with each mile it covered. This is the part of the story that historians have spent generations trying to reconstruct, because the records from that night are incomplete, fragmentary, written almost entirely from the perspective of the white planters who survived, men who were terrified, who were writing in haste, who were trying to make sense of something that had shattered their understanding of the world they lived in. The enslaved people who participated in the uprising left no written records, no diaries, no letters, no testimony that was recorded and preserved by anyone who cared about their perspective. What we know about what happened that night, about what Deslondes said, what he felt, what drove him forward through the darkness, comes from the accounts of his enemies, from the men who hunted him down, from the trial records that followed, from newspaper articles written by white journalists who had no interest in presenting the enslaved people as anything other than savage, violent, and deserving of the punishment that awaited them. So what follows is not a perfect account. It is the best account that history has preserved, and it is enough to understand what happened and why. The rebellion moved south along the River Road, the road that connected the plantations of the German coast to the city of New Orleans, approximately 30 miles to the southeast. Deslondes and his followers did not move quickly. They could not. They were on foot. They were moving through darkness. They were stopping at each plantation they passed to attack, to recruit, to take what supplies they could find: food, water, weapons, anything that would help them keep moving. And as they moved, they left destruction behind them. Plantations burned, sugar mills destroyed, big houses set on fire. The glow of flames could be seen for miles in the flat Louisiana landscape, visible against the dark sky like a line of orange light stretching along the river. It must have been a terrifying sight. For the planters who saw it from a distance, from the safety of their own homes miles away, watching the fire crawl toward them along the coast, it must have been the most frightening thing any of them had ever witnessed. Because it was not just a fire, it was not just destruction, it was proof. Proof that the system they had built, the system that depended on the absolute submission of millions of human beings, was not as secure as they had believed. Proof that the people they had enslaved were not content, were not grateful, were not in any sense at peace with what had been done to them. They were angry. They had always been angry, and tonight they were acting on it. By the early morning hours of January 9th, the rebellion had grown to approximately 250 people. 250 enslaved men and women, armed with machetes and axes and stolen rifles, moving down the river road toward New Orleans. They had destroyed several plantations. They had killed a small number of white residents. The exact number is disputed, but most historians estimate between 2 and 5 people were killed during the march itself. The number is lower than many accounts suggest, and that is significant because it tells us something about what Deslondes and his followers actually wanted. They were not engaged in indiscriminate slaughter. They were not killing everyone they found. They were targeting the plantations, the mills, the infrastructure, the symbols of the system that had enslaved them. The violence was directed, purposeful. It was not rage without focus. It was rage with a destination, and that destination was New Orleans. But New Orleans was not going to be easy to reach, and it was not going to be undefended. The moment the first reports of the uprising reached the city, and they reached it fast, carried by riders who fled the German coast in the pre-dawn hours of January 9th, galloping into New Orleans with news that sent shockwaves through the entire population. The response was immediate. Governor William C. Claiborne, who had been in office since Louisiana became an American territory in 1803, ordered a military response, not a police response, not a law enforcement operation. A military response, because what was happening on the German coast was not, in the eyes of the white power structure, a criminal act. It was an insurrection, a rebellion, a war, and it had to be treated as one. Claiborne mobilized every available military resource in the city. He called up the militia. He ordered cannons moved into position along the river road. He assembled a force of several hundred armed white men, soldiers, militia members, and volunteers from among the planter class, and he sent them north up the river road to meet the rebellion head-on. The force was led by a man named General William G. Bruton de la Mothe, a military officer, experienced, well-armed, and commanding a force that significantly outnumbered the rebels. The confrontation was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was not two armies facing each other on an open field, firing cannons and charging with bayonets. It was more like a hunt. The militia moved up the river road with cannons and rifles and horses and dogs. The rebels were on foot, armed mostly with machetes, with no military training, no artillery, no cavalry, and no route of retreat that did not lead back into the plantations they had just destroyed. The militia caught up with the rebels somewhere along the river road in the early morning hours of January 9th. The exact location is not precisely recorded. But what happened when they met, what the militia did to the men and women who had dared to rise up against the system, that is recorded, in detail, in horrifying, meticulous detail. Because the planters of Louisiana wanted to make sure that what happened next would never be forgotten, not by the enslaved people who heard about it, not by the enslaved people who saw the aftermath, not by anyone, ever. The rebels were overwhelmed quickly. The militia's firepower was simply too great, too organized, too disciplined. The rebels fought, some of them fought desperately, knowing what awaited them if they were captured, but they were outgunned, outmaneuvered, surrounded. Within hours, the rebellion was broken, the fighting was over, and the capture began. Not all 250 rebels were caught that day. Some of them fled back into the swamps, into the bayous, into the dense cypress forests along the river where they had been hiding for years before the uprising. Some of them disappeared completely, never found, never captured, never punished. They vanished into the Louisiana wilderness and were never heard from again. But many were caught, dozens of them, dragged from the fields, from the ditches, from the mud along the riverbank where they had fallen. Bound in chains, thrown onto horses or into carts, and brought back to face what the planters of the German coast had decided would happen to them. And what the planters decided was this: they would not simply execute the rebels. They would not simply hang them and bury them and move on. They would make an example, the most visible, the most brutal, the most terrifying example that Louisiana had ever seen. An example so horrific that no enslaved person who heard about it or who saw it would ever consider rising up again. An example that would burn itself into the collective memory of every enslaved person on the German coast, on the Mississippi River, in the entire state, an example that would last for generations. The trials, if you could call them that, were swift, perfunctory. A handful of enslaved men were brought before a tribunal, not a jury of peers, not a fair legal proceeding, but a group of local planters who had already decided the outcome before the first word of testimony was spoken. The verdict was unanimous: death for all of them. But the method of execution, that was where the true horror began. 44 enslaved men were sentenced to death. 44. Their bodies were executed along the river road, the same road they had marched down the night before, the same road that connected the plantations of the German coast to New Orleans. And their bodies were not simply buried after the execution. They were displayed, publicly, deliberately. Their heads were severed from their bodies after death and placed on poles, 44 heads, mounted on stakes driven into the ground along the river road. One every mile or so, stretching from the site of the rebellion all the way to the outskirts of New Orleans. A line of severed heads, visible to anyone who traveled that road, visible to every enslaved person who passed by on their way to the fields each morning, visible to every man, woman, and child who lived on the German coast. A message, written not in words but in flesh and bone. A message that said, "This is what happens when you fight back. This is what happens when you dare to believe that you deserve to be free. This is what happens when you forget your place." But the execution of the 44 was not the worst of what happened. The worst of what happened was reserved for one man, for Charles Deslondes himself. Deslondes was not captured during the initial confrontation with the militia. He escaped, fled into the swamps, disappeared for a time into the same wilderness that had hidden him during the months of planning. For days he evaded capture. The militia sent search parties into the bayous, into the cypress forests, into every dark, wet, tangled stretch of land where a man could hide. And eventually, the exact date varies depending on the source, but it was within days of the rebellion being broken they found him. The details of his capture are sparse. What is known is that he was taken alive, brought back to the German coast, and handed over to the planters who had decided, collectively, that his punishment would serve as the ultimate example. What they did to Charles Deslondes is one of the most brutal acts of torture ever documented in American history. And it was documented, deliberately, by the men who carried it out. They wanted it recorded. They wanted people to know. They wanted the horror of it to spread not just through Louisiana but through the entire South. A warning, a declaration, a statement that the planter class of the American South would defend its power over enslaved people with every tool at its disposal, including torture that defies easy description. Charles Deslondes was burned alive, but not quickly, not mercifully, not in the way that a fire consumes a body in minutes and ends the suffering. He was burned slowly, deliberately. His hands were chopped off first, both of them, severed at the wrist with an axe while he was still conscious, while he could still feel everything. Then his severed hands were thrown into a fire that had been built specifically for this purpose, and he was forced to watch them burn. Then his body was placed into that same fire, but the fire was not large enough, not hot enough to consume him quickly. It was a slow fire, a controlled fire, one that burned his flesh gradually, layer by layer, while he remained alive, for minutes, for what must have felt like an eternity. The accounts vary on exactly how long the torture lasted. Some say 30 minutes, others say longer, long enough for the pain to become something beyond pain, something beyond what the human mind can process or contain, long enough for Charles Deslondes to understand in the final moments of his life exactly what the system he had fought against was capable of doing to him. And he understood it not as an abstraction, not as a concept, but as a physical, visceral, all-consuming reality that consumed his body from the outside in. He died in that fire, slowly, in agony that words in any language cannot fully capture. And the men who burned him stood nearby and watched, and they felt nothing but satisfaction, because the message had been sent. The aftermath of the German Coast Uprising of 1811 was not simply the death of 44 enslaved men and the torture of Charles Deslondes. The aftermath was silence, a deep, heavy, enforced silence that settled over the entire region like a fog that would not lift. The planters of the German coast did not want anyone talking about what had happened, not in detail, not with any sympathy for the people who had risen up. Not in any way that might suggest that the enslaved people had been justified in their rebellion. Because if they had been justified, if the conditions on the plantations had been bad enough, if the suffering had been great enough to drive 250 people to pick up machetes and march toward freedom, then the planters themselves were complicit. In the suffering, in the deaths, in the centuries of cruelty that had built the wealth they enjoyed. And they did not want that acknowledged, so the story was buried. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually, over decades, over generations. The newspapers that had covered the rebellion in 1811 stopped writing about it. The court records were moved to archives where few people would ever look. The oral histories, the stories that enslaved people told each other about what happened on the German coast, about the night the cane fields burned, about Charles Deslondes and the men and women who had fought and died for freedom, those stories were passed down in whispers, in the quiet spaces where enslaved people could speak without being heard. And over time, as the Civil War came and went, and slavery was abolished and the South was rebuilt, and the decades turned into generations and the generations turned into a century, the story faded. Not because it was not important, because it was inconvenient, because it complicated the narrative that the American South had constructed about itself. The narrative of loyal, content enslaved people, of benevolent masters, of a way of life that was, if not exactly pleasant, at least stable, at least orderly, at least not something that required 250 people to pick up weapons and risk their lives to escape. The German Coast Uprising of 1811 was the largest slave rebellion in American history, larger than Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831, which involved approximately 60 people, larger than any other documented uprising of enslaved people on American soil. And yet, most Americans have never heard of it. It is not taught in most schools. It does not appear in most textbooks. It does not have a museum. It does not have a national monument. It has almost nothing. Almost no public acknowledgement that it ever happened, that 250 people rose up, that 44 were executed, that one man was tortured to death in a way that defies comprehension, that the entire event was deliberately suppressed by the men who had the most to lose from its memory surviving. The silence that settled over the German coast after 1811 did not lift for over 200 years, and in many ways, it has not fully lifted yet. The plantations of the German coast continued to operate after the uprising. The sugarcane continued to grow. The mills continued to grind. The enslaved people continued to work. The ones who had survived the rebellion, the ones who had not been executed, who had not fled into the swamps, who had not been sold to other plantations as punishment, they went back to work the next day. They cut the cane. They fed the mills. They did everything they had done before in exactly the same way under exactly the same conditions. Because there was nothing else to do. The rebellion had failed. The punishment had been delivered. And the system had made clear in the most brutal way possible that resistance would be met with annihilation. So they worked, and they died, quietly, one by one, year by year, buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the cane fields, and the land moved on. The Hadel Plantation, the one that would eventually become Whitney Plantation, continued to expand throughout the 1810s and 1820s and 1830s. More enslaved people were purchased. More cabins were built. More graves were dug. The sugar kept flowing. The money kept coming. And the silence kept deepening. Marie Azalea Hadel, who took over the plantation after Marcelin's death in 1839, ran it with efficiency and ruthlessness. She purchased enslaved people regularly. She maintained production. She kept the plantation profitable through the brutal Louisiana summers and the grinding seasons that followed. And she, like every other planter on the German coast, maintained the silence about what happened on her land, about the people who lived and died there, about the graves that dotted the edge of her property like periods at the end of sentences that no one was allowed to read. When the Civil War came, when the Union Army moved into Louisiana and the plantation system began to collapse, Marie Azalea had already been dead for months. She died in 1860, the same year that Nathaniel Gordon was arrested on the Alabama coast. She left the plantation to her heirs. And for the next century and a half, the Hadel family and then the families who purchased the land after them continued to operate it, continued to grow sugar, continued to profit from land that had been built, maintained, and enriched by the forced labor of hundreds of enslaved people, people whose names were not written down, whose faces were never photographed, whose graves were never marked, whose stories were never told, not until 2014, when a woman named Paula Levy decided to change that. Paula Levy was not a historian. She was not an academic. She was a descendant of the Hadel family itself, a white woman born into the very lineage that had owned the plantation for generations. And she made a decision that no one in her family had ever made before. She decided to tell the truth about what had happened on that land, about the people who had lived and died there, about the silence that had been maintained deliberately for 200 years. She purchased the plantation, and she turned it into a museum. Not a museum that celebrated the plantation, not a museum that romanticized the antebellum South, not a museum that told the story from the perspective of the planters, the way so many plantation museums in the South had done for decades. She turned it into a museum that honored the enslaved people, that named them, that marked their graves, that told their stories, that broke the silence. The museum is called Whitney Plantation. It is located in Wallace, Louisiana, in St. John the Baptist Parish, on the same stretch of land where the Hadel family had grown sugar for over 2 centuries. And when you visit it, when you walk through the fields and past the cabins and along the paths that enslaved people walked every day of their lives, you see something that you do not see at most plantation museums in this country. You see names, carved into iron bells, hundreds of names. The names of the enslaved people who lived and worked and died on that land. Names that had been buried in silence for generations. Names that Paula Levy and her team of historians spent years researching, digging through archives and church records and census documents and sales receipts to recover. Not all of them. Not every single person who ever lived on that plantation has been identified. Some of them are still lost, still nameless, still buried in the silence that the system created for them. But many of them have been found, and their names are there now, on the bells, in the museum, in the public record, for the first time in over 150 years, visible, acknowledged, remembered. But the names on the bells are not the end of this story. They are not even close to the end, because the silence that covered the German coast for 2 centuries did not only erase the names of the enslaved people, it erased the story of what happened to them. The conditions they lived under, the way they died, the rebellion they attempted, the punishment they received, all of it was buried, suppressed, rewritten, and much of it remains buried still. The graves at Whitney Plantation, the unmarked graves where hundreds of enslaved people were buried without ceremony, without markers, without any acknowledgement of their humanity, those graves are still there. Beneath the soil, beneath the roots of the sugar cane that once grew over them, beneath the silence that has covered them for generations. Some of them have been identified through archaeological surveys, ground-penetrating radar, careful excavation. The slow, painstaking work of uncovering what the earth has hidden, but many of them have not been found. Many of them are still there beneath the surface in locations that no one knows, containing the remains of people whose names are not written anywhere, whose lives left no trace in any document or photograph or historical record, people who existed, who breathed, who loved, who suffered, who died, and who were placed into the ground as if they had never been anything at all. The sugar industry of Louisiana did not end with the Civil War. It contracted, it changed, but it did not disappear. Sugar plantations along the Mississippi River continued to operate well into the 20th century. The labor shifted from enslaved people to sharecroppers to migrant workers to eventually mechanized harvesting, but the land remained. The same fields, the same river, and the same silence. The silence that had been built into the very soil of the German coast over 2 centuries of brutal, profitable, deliberately unexamined cruelty. That silence did not end when slavery ended. It did not end when the Civil War was over. It did not end when Reconstruction came and went. It did not end when Jim Crow was dismantled. It did not end when the Civil Rights Act was passed. It persisted, quietly, invisibly, in the way that all silences persist when no one is willing to break them. And it persists still, in the gaps between what we know and what we do not know, in the names that have never been recovered, in the graves that have never been found, in the story of Charles Deslondes and the night the German coast burned, a story that 250 people lived and died for, and that most of the country has never heard. So let us sit with that for a moment. Let us not move past it. Let us not rush toward the conclusion or the analysis or the neat, tidy wrap-up that documentaries often provide at the end of a story like this. Let us simply sit here, in the silence, in the weight of everything we have just covered, because there is a tendency when we talk about history like this, when we talk about slavery and rebellion and torture and erasure, to treat it as something distant, something that happened a long time ago to other people in another world. Something that can be acknowledged, discussed, and then set aside, filed away in the part of the mind where uncomfortable truths go to be forgotten. But this story does not allow that. It does not permit that kind of distance, because the land is still there, the graves are still there, the silence is still there. And the consequences of what happened on the German coast, the consequences of what happened at Whitney Plantation, and on every other plantation along the Mississippi River, those consequences did not end when the last enslaved person was freed. They did not end when the last sugar mill closed. They did not end when the last planter died, and the last fortune built on forced labor was dispersed among heirs who never had to think about where that wealth came from. The consequences are here, now. In this country, in this century, living and breathing inside a system that was built, from the very beginning, on the erasure of certain human beings, and understanding that, truly understanding it, is the only reason this story matters at all. The German Coast Uprising of 1811 was not simply a rebellion. It was not simply a military event that can be analyzed in terms of strategy and tactics and outcome. It was a statement, a declaration made by 250 human beings who had been told, every single day of their lives, that they were worth nothing, that they were property, that their bodies, their labor, their very existence existed solely to generate wealth for other people. And those 250 people looked at that declaration and they said no, not with words, not with petitions or protests or legal challenges or any of the other mechanisms that free people use to challenge systems they disagree with. They said no with machetes, with fire, with their bodies and their blood and their willingness to die for something that, in the eyes of the men who enslaved them, did not even exist: their freedom. The rebellion failed. Militarily, tactically, in every measurable sense, it was a failure. The rebels were outnumbered, outgunned, outmaneuvered. They did not reach New Orleans. They did not liberate the German coast. They did not overthrow the plantation system. They did not change anything in the immediate practical sense. The plantations kept running the next day. The enslaved people kept working. The sugar kept flowing. Nothing changed. And yet something did change, something subtle. Something that cannot be measured in acres or dollars or tons of sugar. Something that lives in the space between what the planters wanted the enslaved people to believe and what the enslaved people actually felt. Because after January 9th, 1811, the planters of the German coast knew something they had not known before. They knew that the silence they had imposed on the enslaved population was not acceptance. It was not contentment. It was not gratitude. It was fear. Pure, enforced, brutally maintained fear. And fear, no matter how effectively it is imposed, is not the same thing as peace. It is not the same thing as order. It is not the same thing as a system that will hold forever. Fear can be maintained for years, for generations, but it cannot be maintained without constant vigilance, without constant punishment, without constant reminders like the 44 heads on stakes along the river road of what happens when fear falters. And that is an exhausting way to build a civilization, an exhausting way to maintain power, an exhausting way to live, knowing that the people who work your land, who cook your food, who raise your children, who are present in every corner of your daily life, knowing that those people hate you. Not passively, not abstractly, but with a rage that, given the right moment, the right circumstances, the right leader, will turn them into something the planter class of Louisiana had never truly believed was possible. Soldiers. The psychological toll of slavery on the enslaved is something that historians and psychologists have studied extensively. The trauma, the intergenerational damage, the way in which centuries of dehumanization shape not just individuals but entire communities, entire cultures, entire ways of understanding the world. But there is another psychological dimension to slavery that receives far less attention: the psychological toll on the enslaved who resist. On the men and women who, despite everything, despite the punishment, despite the surveillance, despite the constant and overwhelming power of the system arrayed against them, choose to fight. Because resistance under slavery was not simply an act of courage. It was an act of psychological warfare, fought on terrain that was entirely hostile, against an enemy that controlled every aspect of your existence, with weapons that were laughably inadequate compared to the weapons of your oppressors. And with a near-certain knowledge that if you were caught, if you failed, the punishment would not simply be death. It would be torture, public, prolonged, designed specifically to break not just your body but your will, and the will of every enslaved person who heard about it. Charles Deslondes understood this. He understood before he began planning the rebellion exactly what would happen to him if it failed. He understood that the planters would not simply execute him. They would make an example of him. They would destroy him in a way that would echo through the enslaved population for generations, and he chose to do it anyway. That choice, that decision to act in full knowledge of the consequences, is one of the most remarkable acts of human courage in American history, and it is almost entirely unknown, not because it does not deserve to be known, but because the people who controlled the narrative, the people who wrote the history books, who built the museums, who decided which stories were worth telling and which were worth burying, those people had no interest in making Charles Deslondes a hero. Because if Deslondes was a hero, then the system he fought against was not simply a legal arrangement or an economic structure or a way of life that the South defended with pride. It was a system so brutal, so dehumanizing, so fundamentally incompatible with the idea of human dignity that it drove people to pick up weapons and march toward death rather than continue to live under it. And that was not a story the American South wanted to tell. So they buried it, and for 200 years it stayed buried. The planters of the German coast did not simply suppress the memory of the uprising through silence. They actively worked to prevent the story from spreading. In the years and decades that followed 1811, any enslaved person who was suspected of sympathizing with the rebellion, of discussing it, of remembering it, of drawing inspiration from it, was punished, sometimes severely. The planters understood as well as anyone that memory was dangerous, that a story once told could not be untold, that the knowledge that 250 people had risen up and fought, even if they had lost, could inspire others to try. So they cut off the story at its source. They punished the tellers. They destroyed the records. They ensured that the rebellion was remembered, if it was remembered at all, not as an act of resistance but as an act of savagery, not as a desperate bid for freedom but as proof that enslaved people were violent, dangerous, incapable of governing themselves, needing the firm hand of the white master to keep them in line. This reframing was deliberate, calculated, and it worked. For generations, the German Coast Uprising was not remembered as a rebellion. It was remembered where it was remembered at all, as a slave revolt, a distinction that carries enormous weight. A rebellion implies legitimacy, implies that the people who fought had a reason to fight, implies that the system they fought against was unjust. A slave revolt implies the opposite. It implies chaos, savagery, a breakdown of order that had to be restored by force. The language itself, the words chosen to describe what happened, reveals the bias of the people who wrote the history. And for 200 years, that bias shaped how Americans understood not just the German Coast Uprising but every act of resistance by enslaved people in this country. Nat Turner was not a revolutionary. He was a savage. Gabriel, who planned a rebellion in Richmond in 1800, was not a freedom fighter. He was a criminal. Toussaint Louverture, who led the Haitian Revolution to victory, was not a hero of liberation. He was a threat, a warning, an example of what happened when enslaved people were allowed to think for themselves. The language of slavery did not simply describe reality. It created it. It defined who was human and who was not, who deserved freedom and who did not, who was capable of leading and who was meant only to follow. And that language, that framework of understanding, did not disappear when slavery ended. It persisted, in subtler forms, in the way that certain stories are told and others are not, in the way that certain histories are taught and others are buried, in the way that the contributions, the resistance, the courage, and the humanity of enslaved people are acknowledged or erased depending on who is doing the telling. Whitney Plantation today is not what it was in 1811, or in 1839, or in 1860. The big house has been restored. The sugar mill has been preserved. The slave cabins have been stabilized, maintained, made accessible to visitors who walk through them and try to imagine what it was like to live in a space that small, that dark, that close to the ground. But the most striking feature of Whitney Plantation, the feature that separates it from every other plantation museum in Louisiana, in the South, in the entire country, is the wall of names. It is exactly what it sounds like, a wall covered in iron bells, and on each bell engraved into the metal a name, the name of an enslaved person who lived on that land, men and women and children who were born there or sold there or died there or all three, names recovered from church baptismal records, from Catholic parish documents, from census records where enslaved people were listed by first name only, from probate documents where they were listed as property, assigned dollar values, transferred from one owner to another like furniture or livestock. The names are not complete, they are fragments, first names, sometimes ages, sometimes descriptions, Congo, meaning the person was from the Congo region of Africa, Creole, meaning they were born in Louisiana. Sometimes nothing at all beyond a single word that represents an entire human life, but they are there, visible, public, acknowledged. For the first time in the history of that land, the people who built it are being seen, not as numbers, not as property, not as units of labor, as people, with names. And the names tell their own story, a story of where these people came from. Many of them were from Africa, from the Congo, from Senegal, from the Yoruba-speaking regions of West Africa, from places thousands of miles away across an ocean. They were brought to Louisiana by slave traders, legally before 1808 and illegally after. They were sold at auction in New Orleans. They were purchased by planters on the German coast and transported to plantations where they would spend the rest of their lives. However long or short those lives turned out to be working land that would never belong to them. Some of the names on the bells belonged to children, boys and girls who were born into slavery on the plantation, who grew up in the cabins, who began working in the fields before they were teenagers, who, in many cases, never saw the age of 30. The sugar industry consumed them the same way it consumed their parents, the same way it consumed everyone, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony or acknowledgement or any of the rituals that free societies use to mark the passage of a human life. There is a particular grief that comes with reading those names, a grief that is not entirely rational because you did not know these people, you never met them. You have no personal connection to them beyond the simple, irreducible fact that they were human beings, that they existed, that they suffered, and that the world they lived in did everything in its power to make sure that their suffering was invisible. Reading their names on those bells is, in a small way, a refusal to let that invisibility stand. It is an act of witness, of acknowledgement, of the most basic form of human recognition, the recognition that a life was lived, that it mattered, even if no one at the time believed it did. The connection between Whitney Plantation and the German Coast Uprising of 1811 is not accidental. Whitney Plantation sits on land that was owned, in 1811, by the Hadel family, the same family that would later pass the plantation down through generations of sugar planters. The uprising did not happen on the Hadel plantation itself, but it happened nearby, miles away, along the same river road, on the same stretch of coast. And the reverberations of that uprising, the fear it created, the punishment it provoked, the silence it imposed, those reverberations settled over the entire German coast, over every plantation, over every enslaved person, over the Hadel plantation and the people who lived and died there. The silence that Paula Levy broke when she opened Whitney Plantation as a museum was not simply the silence of one plantation. It was the silence of an entire region, of an entire era, of an entire system that had been designed from the very beginning to make certain human beings invisible. And the names on the bells, the names of the enslaved people who lived on that land, are not simply names. They are cracks in that silence, small ones, imperfect ones, but cracks nonetheless, and light gets in through cracks. But we cannot end this story with light, because the truth is darker than that. The truth is that the silence Paula Levy broke at Whitney Plantation is not the only silence. It is not even the deepest one, because the graves at Whitney Plantation, the unmarked graves where hundreds of enslaved people were buried without markers, without ceremony, without any record of who they were, those graves have not all been found. Some of them have been located through archaeological work, through ground-penetrating radar, through careful, patient excavation that takes months or years to complete. But many of them have not been found. They are still there, beneath the soil, beneath the roots, beneath the surface of a land that has been walked over, farmed, lived on, and profited from for over 250 years. And the people in those graves, the people whose bones are still beneath the Louisiana earth, they do not have names on any bell. They do not have any acknowledgement at all. They are the deepest silence. The silence that no museum can fully break. The silence that no amount of research or archaeology or historical scholarship can completely penetrate, because some things are simply lost, lost to time, lost to the deliberate destruction of records, lost to the indifference of a system that never considered these people worth documenting in the first place. They are gone, not just from the world, from history itself. And that is the cruelest form of erasure there is, not killing a person, not even torturing them, erasing them, making them disappear so completely that the only evidence they ever existed is the faint impression they left in the soil, a slight depression in the ground, a change in the color of the earth, something that, if you did not know what you were looking for, you would walk right over without ever knowing it was there. The German Coast Uprising of 1811 is taught, where it is taught at all as a footnote, a brief mention in a chapter on slave resistance, a paragraph at most in a textbook that spends dozens of pages on the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation and the Reconstruction era. It does not receive the attention it deserves. It does not receive the moral weight it carries. 250 people rose up. 44 were executed. One man was tortured to death in a way that remains, even by the brutal standards of 19th century punishment, extraordinarily horrific. And the story was buried, deliberately, systematically, by the men who had the most to lose from its telling. That burial did not happen by accident. Happened because the American South, the planter class, the political establishment, the cultural institutions that shaped how history was remembered and told, decided collectively that certain stories were too dangerous to preserve. Stories that challenged the narrative of a peaceful, orderly, God-given racial hierarchy. Stories that showed enslaved people not as passive, grateful laborers, but as human beings capable of courage, of strategy, of sacrifice, and of fighting back. Those stories were suppressed, rewritten, buried in archives, removed from curricula, replaced with stories that were easier to tell, stories that made the white South comfortable, stories that preserved the myth. And for generations, for over 200 years, those suppressed stories stayed buried. The German Coast Uprising stayed buried. The names of the enslaved people at Whitney Plantation stayed buried. The graves stayed unmarked. The silence held until it did not, until Paula Levy opened a museum, until historians began digging through archives, until archaeologists began scanning the ground with radar, until slowly, imperfectly, painfully, the silence began to crack, not all at once, not completely, but enough. Enough for some of the names to be recovered. Enough for some of the graves to be found. Enough for the story of Charles Deslondes to be told again after 2 centuries of suppression in a way that acknowledges what it actually was. Not a slave revolt, a rebellion, a declaration of humanity made by people who had been told every day of their lives that they had no humanity left to declare, and enough for us to be here, now, listening, bearing witness to a story that the world tried very hard to make sure we would never hear. The land along the Mississippi River in Louisiana has not changed, not fundamentally. The river still moves in the same direction it has always moved. The soil is still dark and rich and fertile. The air is still heavy with humidity. The light still falls in the same way it fell 200 years ago, golden in the morning, harsh at midday, and soft, almost gentle, in the late afternoon when the shadows stretch long across the fields. If you were to stand on the grounds of Whitney Plantation today, if you were to walk slowly through the fields where the sugar cane once grew, past the cabins where enslaved people lived and died, past the mill where the cane was ground and the juice was boiled, you would not feel anything necessarily. The land does not vibrate with the memory of what happened there. It does not whisper or moan or reveal its secrets to anyone who happens to walk across it. It is just land, just earth, just soil and grass and roots and the quiet sounds of birds and wind and the distant movement of water. But somewhere beneath your feet, somewhere in the dark, silent, undisturbed earth, there are people. People who built this land with their hands, who bled for it, who died on it, who were buried in it without names or markers or any of the rituals that human beings have used since the very beginning of civilization to honor the dead. They are there, beneath the silence, beneath the centuries, beneath the layers of history that have been piled on top of them, one after another, until they are so deep that most of the world does not even know they exist. And they will stay there, for as long as the land exists, for as long as the river moves, for as long as the earth holds, silent, patient, waiting, not for justice. Justice at this point is a word that does not apply. You cannot give justice to the dead. You cannot undo what was done to them. You cannot return what was taken. You cannot bring back the names that were never written down or the faces that were never captured in any photograph or the lives that were cut short by a system that valued their labor more than their existence. What you can do, what we can do here now in this moment, is something much smaller than justice, but something that matters, something that costs nothing except attention, except presence, Except the willingness to listen to a story that the world tried to silence. We can remember them. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. We can say their names, the ones we know. We can acknowledge the ones we do not know. We can stand on the ground where they lived and died, and we can refuse to walk away pretending it was just land, just soil, just another piece of real estate along a river in Louisiana. It was not just land. It was never just land. It was a place where human beings lived, where they suffered, where they resisted, where they died, and where they were buried in silence that lasted for 2 centuries. The silence is not completely broken. It may never be completely broken. Some of the names are gone forever. Some of the graves will never be found. Some of the stories, the personal, intimate, irreplaceable stories of individual human beings who lived and breathed and loved and feared, those stories are lost. Lost in the way that only history can lose things. Completely, irrevocably, without any possibility of recovery. But the silence has been cracked. And through those cracks, through the names on the bells at Whitney Plantation, through the story of Charles Deslondes and the night the German coast burned, through the slow and difficult work of historians and archaeologists and museum directors who have dedicated their lives to recovering what was buried, through all of that, some light has gotten in. Not enough, never enough, but some, and for now, for today. That is where we leave this story, not with an answer, not with resolution. Not with the comfortable feeling that justice has been served or that history has been made whole. We leave it with a question, a quiet one that does not demand a response but simply asks to be held. If you knew nothing about this story before today, if the German Coast Uprising, if Whitney Plantation, if the name Charles Deslondes meant nothing to you before you pressed play on this video, then something has changed. Something small, something invisible to anyone watching from the outside, but real. You know now, you carry it now. The names, the graves, the silence, the rebellion, the torture, the erasure. You carry it with you out of this video back into your life, back into the world that does not talk about these things, that does not teach these things, that does not want you to think about these things. And the question is simply this. Now that you know, what do you do with it? That is not a rhetorical question. It is not a flourish. It is not a dramatic ending designed to make you feel something and then forget about it by tomorrow. It is a real question, asked in good faith. To you, the person listening right now, in this moment, what do you do with a story like this? What do you do when history hands you something that cannot be fixed, cannot be undone, cannot be made right? What do you do when the silence is too deep to fully break and the graves are too old to find and the names are too few to account for everyone who suffered? What do you do? That is the legacy of the German coast. That is the legacy of Whitney Plantation. That is the legacy of Charles Deslondes and the 44 men whose heads were placed on stakes along a river road in Louisiana over 200 years ago. That is the legacy of every unnamed, unmarked, unacknowledged person who lived and died on 487 acres of silence. And it is not finished. It is not resolved. It is not a story with an ending. It is a story that is still happening, in the silence, in the land, in the blood and the memory and the quiet, persistent weight of history that refuses, no matter how hard the world tries to bury it, to stay buried. Remember them.